All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Mark chapter 3.
Oh yeah, this is a good one.
It's packed with action, like healing and controversies, even some family drama.
Yeah, kind of reminds you of a reality show, first century style, right?
Totally.
But really, though, one of the things that jumps out at me is how this chapter kicks off this, like, power struggle between Jesus and the religious authorities.
Okay, yeah.
You know, it's almost like the calm before the storm.
Okay.
We see it right away in that story of the man with the withered hand.
Right away. The Pharisees are already watching Jesus.
Oh, yes.
Like, they're just waiting for him to slip up, you know?
Yeah.
So they can accuse him of breaking, like, their Sabbath rules.
It's interesting, isn't it, how that Sabbath was just so central to Jewish life back then.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to remember the Pharisees. These guys were known for their strict interpretation of the law.
So for them, it's more about upholding their version of the law than, having compassion for this guy who's suffering.
Absolutely. But, Jesus, he turns the tables on them.
Yeah, he did.
He asks them, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or do harm, to save life or to kill?
Such a good question.
Basically, he's saying, like, isn't it more important to help someone in need than to blindly follow some rule?
Yeah. He's challenging them to really think about, like, the purpose behind the law.
Mm-hmm.
And they're silent.
They can't answer.
They can't answer. Which is interesting, but what really got to me, like what really struck me, is how Mark describes Jesus's reaction.
Oh, yeah.
He's angry and grieved by their hard hearts.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he sees their potential for good, but they're choosing to be, closed off to it.
And that really shows us something about Jesus.
Yeah.
It shows us that he's not just some, like, distant miracle worker.
No.
But he's deeply affected by people's suffering and their resistance to his message.
It's personal for him.
Yeah. And you know what their response is? They actually start plotting with the Herodians.
No.
Yeah, these are, political guys to kill him.
Wow. Talk about holding a grudge.
It's serious.
So we go from this really intense confrontation to a scene of, like, immense popularity, right? Huge crowds are swarming Jesus by the sea, drawn by his miracles and teachings.
Good Beatlemania, but with more sandals.
Yes, exactly. But it's interesting because they're not just there for the show, they're desperately seeking healing.
Right, yeah.
Like Mark tells us that everyone who had diseases was pushing to touch him.
Imagine that.
And it's not just that. Even unclean spirits, which we might think of as demonic forces today, right?
Yeah.
They're recognizing him as the Son of God.
It's a huge moment in Mark's gospel.
It is.
Because we see Jesus' power on full display. But at the same time, there's this sense of, like, chaos and urgency.
Oh, yeah.
And think about what it means for those unclean spirits to call him the Son of God. It suggests that even forces that are opposed to God recognize his authority.
Wow, that is powerful. So with all these people, all this commotion, Jesus must need some help, like, managing this growing movement.
Absolutely. And that's where the selection of the 12 apostles comes in.
Right.
Jesus goes up this mountain. This is, a symbolic place that's often associated with divine encounters.
Yeah.
And he handpicks these 12 men to be his closest followers.
The number 12?
Yeah.
I mean, that can't be random, right?
No, definitely not. It intentionally echoes the 12 tribes of Israel.
Okay.
Which, as you know, are the foundation of the Jewish nation.
Yeah.
So it's like a signal that Jesus is forming a new community, a new people of God that's centered around him and not just, a religious system.
So interesting how all these historical details, they just add so much depth to the story.
They really do.
So we get this roll call of the 12 apostles, Simon, who Jesus renames Peter, Andrew, James, John.
Oh, yeah.
James and John get this nickname, Sons of Thunder.
What's up with that?
I mean, were they known for having these booming voices or something?
I wish Mark gave us more details.
I know, right?
Some scholars think it refers to their personalities.
Okay.
Maybe they were a little quick to anger or zealous.
I can see that.
Which, we see hints of that later in the gospel.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got the Pharisees plotting, these massive crowds looking for healing, the 12 apostles getting, like, their marching orders.
It's a busy day.
It's a busy day. And then it gets really personal. Jesus's family
Oh, boy.
enters the picture.
And here come the accusations.
Yeah. But it's so interesting because they're coming from two very different places, right?
Yeah.
So his family thinks he's out of his mind.
Right.
But the religious experts, they're convinced that he's possessed by Beelzebul, which was another name for Satan back then.
It's wild.
I know. They can't even agree on what's wrong with him.
Well, this kind of shows us how people viewed mental illness and spiritual stuff back in the first century, right?
Yeah.
So for his family, maybe they're embarrassed by his, unconventional behavior.
They're like, come on, Jesus, get it together.
Right. It looks like a mental breakdown to them.
Yeah.
But the religious experts, they see him as this threat.
Of course.
So they immediately jump to demonic possession.
So it's not even just about, like, whether or not they believe he can do miracles. It's about how they choose to interpret those miracles.
That's a really good point.
So how does Jesus respond to all this?
He doesn't shy away from it at all, especially not that Beelzebul claim.
I mean, he kind of addresses it head on.
Yeah, he uses this clever parable.
I love his parables.
Yeah. He asks, how can Satan cast out Satan?
Mm-hmm.
And he points out that a kingdom that's divided against itself can't stand.
It's so simple.
It is.
But it's so powerful.
Yeah, he's basically saying, if I'm driving out demons, it proves I'm not working with Satan. I'm fighting against him.
Yeah, exactly. But then he takes it even further.
He does.
With that image of a strong man.
Oh, that's a good one.
He says, no one can plunder a strong man's house unless they first tie him up, right? So Jesus is the strong man here. And Satan's the one getting tied up.
Exactly.
Mm.
Jesus has authority over evil,
Mm-hmm.
and his whole mission is to free people from its grip.
That is such a powerful way to think about it. So we've got these accusations flying around.
From all sides.
From all sides. And then, as if things couldn't get any more dramatic, who shows up?
Oh, no.
His mom and brothers.
Family drama.
I know, right? It's like a reality TV show. And it kind of highlights this human side of Jesus.
For sure.
They've heard all this crazy stuff that he's doing.
It's got to be hard for them.
It is. And they, they're worried.
Of course.
And Mark even tells us that they thought he was out of his mind.
Yeah, and they want to take him home.
Yeah. So they show up while he's teaching, and someone tells him, hey, your mom and brothers are out here looking for you.
What happens next?
And then Jesus says this really unexpected thing.
Oh.
Who are my mother and my brothers?
Wow.
I mean, that's radical, especially back then when family was everything.
It really is.
He's not rejecting them, but he is redefining what it means to be truly connected.
Yeah. And then he gestures to his disciples, right?
Yes.
And says, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother.
Such a powerful statement.
So powerful, especially for that culture. It challenges everything they thought they knew about family.
Totally. And it expands, like, the definition of belonging.
For sure.
For anyone who chooses to follow Jesus.
I love it.
So in just this one chapter, we've got Jesus healing, teaching, dealing with opposition from, like, every side, and redefining family.
What a chapter.
I know. It really packs a punch and challenges us to think about who Jesus is and what he's all about.
And it raises some big questions for us, too.
It does.
About loyalty, faith, belonging.
Yeah.
And, makes it clear that following Jesus isn't just about showing up for religious services. It's about a whole reorientation of your priorities.
It's about a changed life.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we move on, I got to go back to that statement about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit.
Oh, yeah. That's a tough one.
I mean, it's always seemed like such a harsh warning, It
is. It is. It's hard to hear about, like, an unforgivable sin and not feel a little uneasy.
Totally. So what do you think he's getting at there?
Well, there are a couple different ways to understand it.
Okay.
Some scholars think it refers to the ultimate rejection of God's grace, even when it's, like, right in front of you.
So, like, they're seeing all the good that Jesus is doing, the healing, the teaching, but they're still choosing to say it's evil.
Yeah, exactly. And that's essentially what the Pharisees were doing, right?
The whole Beelzebul thing.
Yeah, they were attributing Jesus' power to Satan.
So it's not about saying, like, a bad word, but about this deep rejection of who Jesus is and what he represents.
That's a good way to put it. It's a rejection of the truth.
Right. And that makes sense given everything else going on in this chapter.
Oh, yeah. Things escalate quickly in Mark.
They do. I mean, we go from healing to accusations to, like, actual murder plots in just a few verses.
That's Mark's style. Fast-paced, action-packed. He's like the
Michael Bay of gospel raiders.
Uh-huh. There you go. He uses vivid language, strong verbs, and he jumps quickly from scene to scene.
So instead of a slow burn, it's more like an action thriller.
Exactly. And that sense of urgency draws you in, keeps you on the edge of your seat.
It makes you realize how radical Jesus' ministry really was, how it turned the world upside down.
And that's probably why Mark's gospel is the shortest of the four.
Yeah. It's short but powerful.
Oh, yeah. Super powerful. And the way he writes it just makes those teachings even more impactful.
Totally. It's like you're right there experiencing it with Jesus.
You really feel the immediacy of it all.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this section of our deep dive, what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do you want them to remember from this part of Mark chapter 3?
I think the biggest takeaway is that that following Jesus can be challenging.
Yeah.
There will be opposition, maybe even from the people you least expect.
So even from our own families or communities.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important to remember that when we choose to follow Jesus, we become part of something bigger.
We're not alone.
We're not alone. We're part of this new family, this community of people striving to live according to God's will.
And that community can provide support when things get tough, when we face those challenges.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it reminds us that following Jesus isn't just about individual piety.
It's about being part of something much bigger.
It's a movement, a force for good in the world.
And that's a beautiful thing.
It is.
Not escaping from the world, but transforming it.
Through love, compassion, and justice.
Okay, this has been an incredible discussion so far.
It really has. And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know. There's always so much more to learn.
Well, good news. We've got more to cover.
We do.
Yeah, it's time to move on to chapter 4.
I'm excited. What can we expect?
More teachings, more miracles, more drama. Jesus calms the storm, teaches in parables. Oh, and there's even more pushback from those who just don't get it.
Oh, I can't wait. You know, it's amazing how much opposition Jesus faced, even from his own family. Imagine trying to explain to your family that you're the Son of God.
Oh, yeah, that'd be a tough conversation for sure. But it's interesting how Jesus handles all of that opposition, right?
Yeah.
He never backed down from what he was supposed to do.
Yeah.
But he also never forced himself on anyone.
Yeah, like he was always inviting people to think differently, to live differently.
Exactly. And sometimes they resisted that invitation.
Of course.
Sometimes they were curious about it. And sometimes, they just embraced it wholeheartedly.
Yeah, like he was planting these seeds.
Exactly.
And some fell on, fertile ground and some didn't. But those that did, they grew into something amazing. This community of people who risked everything to follow him.
Yeah. And that community, that became the foundation for the whole Christian church.
So what can we learn from those early followers? What can we take from their experience and apply it to our own lives today?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is that idea of putting God's will first, above everything else.
Yeah.
Remember how Jesus challenged all those social norms,
Yeah.
the religious traditions, even family ties when they got in the way of his mission?
That's a big deal.
It is. It reminds us that following Jesus might mean making some hard choices.
Yeah.
Stepping outside our comfort zones, letting go of some things that are really important to us.
But ultimately, it's about aligning ourselves with something so much bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely.
It's about realizing that we're part of God's story, and we each have a role to play.
Yeah, and that role might be different for each of us. Some people are called to teach, some to heal, some to fight for justice.
Right.
But no matter what our calling is, we're all invited to join in, to be part of building God's kingdom here on earth.
So it's not just about escaping from the world, but about being in the world and making a difference.
Exactly. It's about being the hands and feet of Jesus, showing God's love in practical ways.
And that brings us back to that radical statement Jesus made about family.
Yeah, about redefining family.
Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother.
Such a powerful statement. And it reminds us that our true family isn't just about, who we're related to.
Right.
It includes everyone who's united by faith, by obedience to God.
It's like a spiritual family that goes beyond all those cultural and ethnic and even denominational boundaries.
Exactly. And that's what's so beautiful about the Christian faith, right?
Yeah.
It's this global movement that brings together people from all walks of life, all under the banner of God's love.
Well, we've covered so much ground today. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with as we wrap up our deep dive into Mark chapter 3?
I would just say this. As you go about your day, remember that you are part of something much bigger than yourself. You're part of God's family, and you're invited to join him in bringing healing and hope and transformation to the world around you.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Mark chapter 3. We hope you've been inspired and challenged by this conversation. Keep seeking truth, asking questions, and discovering the richness of God's word. Until next time.